What if Baldur's Gate 3 was first person and action oriented? Would you still play it? With Baldur's Gate 3 about to launch from Larian, that's raised some questions about the game, like why did it take 23 years for us to get a sequel to Baldur's Gate 2? One of the reasons may be the unique pitch from the co-creator of Fallout, Cain, and his company Troika, which promised to be a tectonic shift in how Baldur's Gate would be played. An action RPG with a sole character that would play in first person, one that even dared to have PvP. It apparently didn't sit very well with Wizards of the Coast because right now it currently only sits in the documents that Mr. Kane was kind enough to share with us. Before we get into the game's proposal itself, which is pretty damn wild for a Baldur's Gate game, let's cover some of the backstory. Who is Cain? Kane first worked with Interplay on the original Fallout from 1994 to 1999 when it released. He'd go on to work on other titles at Interplay, including writing the main story for Fallout 2 before leaving to co-found Troika Games alongside fellow Interplay alums Leonard Boyarsky and Jason D. Anderson. Troika would then make Arcanum in 2001, Dungeons & Dragons: The Temple of Elemental Evil in 2003, and the cult classic Vampire the Masquerade: Bloodlines in 2004, before Troika closed in 2005. Much further down the line, Cain worked on the standout RPGs from Obsidian Entertainment, Pillars of Eternity, a Kickstarter RPG, and the more recent The Outer Worlds, which has a sequel in the works. He's also a very friendly looking fellow, and I've included his original video down below if you want to hear all the details from the man himself. So now we know a bit more about Cain. But what about the proposal? The proposal that never materialized. Baldur's Gate 3 would have been first person, a huge departure from the original 2 games and even the Dark Alliance games, which in themselves were a simplified and more action-oriented version of Baldur's Gate. Cain likened this to Jedi Outcast style combat where you were first person but had third person for melee combat. It also sounds a bit like the game he would have gone on to make, Vampire the Masquerade. I think the reaction to this can be summed up pretty well by this comment on Kane's video and his understanding response.
You were planning on changing Baldur's Gate into a first-person game? You monsters!
I know. It gets worse, or better though, depending on who you ask, as you would only control one character through the entire game. Though you could get followers, 1 or 2 of them based on either your charisma or level. From the sound of it, you wouldn't be controlling them like you do in Baldur's Gate games. This had already kind of happened with Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, but those games were designed around the idea of couch co-op as they were strictly on console. So you'd still be playing with others. In fact, playing those games solo at times can feel a bit lonely. Hello? Hello? But it wasn't just the mainline Baldur's Gate games that Troika was upending. D&D was on the chopping block as well. Cain wanted to move away from the very literal take on D&D he had done in Temple of Elemental Evil, and instead create an adapted D&D. In his words, this was because with Elemental Evil, they had made a computer game as true as possible to the paper and pencil game. It was essentially done. Enter the proposal, making a very action-oriented version of D&D and rewriting all of the rules so it could be played first-person real-time on a PC. They removed intelligence and wisdom and only had 4 attributes: strength, dex, constitution, and charisma. They weren't rolled at the start of the game, instead they were based off of your class, and they'd improve based on that template every few levels. They then proposed introducing a new attribute called fatigue, which replaced the need to memorize spells, essentially making a mana pool. This allowed for real-time magic use, which, given how the game was being built, it sounds kind of essential to make the change since everything was happening real-time, and leaving it as it was would have had seriously hindered non-magic users. They used fatigue in part because of how they handled classes in-game, unifying a resource pool to allow for multi-classing. Speaking of which, the game was going to launch with 8 classes, bard, cleric, druid, fighter, a mage with arcane spells, which sounds a bit like a wizard, a monk, a ranger, and a rogue. All of these could be leveled up into either prestige classes or multi-class, which would let you spend the level you just earned on any of the classes. Essentially having like a level 10 fighter with a level 2 rogue, so you could have the skills of a level 10 fighter and a level 2 rogue. It sounds interesting enough, but I could also see how this might get a little bit clunky. In fact, this may just be my experience, but every DM that I've ever played with has kind of tried to pull me away from the idea of multi-classing and stick with going with prestige classes. But that's not the most intriguing part of this proposal. The one thing that I think could work really well in a game releasing in 2023, and something that hasn't actually happened very much in the fantasy gaming space: PVPVE. In what sounds like a more advanced version of Dark and Darker, a key element to Troika's vision for Baldur's Gate 3 included a multiplayer PvP element with cooperative competitive play where players would race against each other and work together to complete quests as quickly as possible, or fight each other in arenas. It did sound like these were kind of separate gameplay styles, so I don't think this was exactly like Dark and Darker where you were fighting against each other. It sounds more like it was, a race against time, who beat the quest faster. But it still sounds interesting. And perhaps, what if we could combine those things into a new game, a new and interesting game? Of course, that game would not be Baldur's Gate. It just doesn't seem to fit with Baldur's Gate. I was a fan of what I saw from Dark and Darker, and it really makes me hope that someone creates a game like this, a PvPVE fantasy game somewhere in the middle of Troika's proposal and Dark and Darker's. A PvPVE style fantasy game with a mode where you can race to complete engaging quests sounds like too much fun to pass up, especially if you can kind of throw a wrench into the works of other players. And with the woes that Dark and Darker is currently facing, there's a gap in the genre to make a game like this. So ball's in your court if you're a game developer. All of that said, the Troika proposal sounds like an even greater departure from the original RPGs than either the Dark Alliance games or the actual Baldur's Gate 3 that we're getting from Larian. The general consensus from the comments on Tim Kane's video seems to see this as a bullet dodge that perhaps while the idea itself sounds like it could have been cool, not as a Baldur's Gate 3. And since it was turned down by Wizard of the Coast, it feels a little bit like I'm giving them too much credit, and it's making me a little uncomfortable. So I want to turn it to you. What do you think of the proposal? What would you have enjoyed this game? Would you have enjoyed it as a Baldur's Gate 3? Or do you just want a PvPVE game like I do? Let us know down in the comment section below, because I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. In the meantime, if you want to prepare yourself for Baldur's Gate 3, I covered why I think this game is going to be such a great game a couple months ago in this video right here, and I did it in part because of how it's tied to D&D in its current edition. My name is Redbeard Flynn, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.